Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics, and this is the Political Postbox, where I take a look at about half a dozen or so comments that have been engaged with on my videos from the past week. And it should come as no surprise that this week will be very heavily influenced, not exclusively, but very heavily influenced by the Dominic Cummings saga. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, on to the first one. It's a longish one. It says, there's just one comment on your video that I disagree with, and the video, to add a little bit of context, was talking about the damage that this will, the handling effectively of Dominic Cummings. It's not Dominic Cummings' rule breaking itself, but the handling of it will cause the Conservatives in a few years' time, because there are people that will take the view that, you know, things like this die down. The public are angry at the moment, it will subside, and generally speaking that will be true. So to go through the whole comment, just one comment on your video I disagree with. It would be great if what you say about that will actually come true, but I honestly don't believe that the rise in cases and deaths in June will be another nail in the government's coffin. The government will blame the people and say that the rise in deaths is solely the fault of the irresponsible public. Of course, it won't convince people like us because we won't blindly follow them. The same people who voted Tory last election to get Brexit done will believe that wholeheartedly because they have to convince themselves that they were right to vote for a Brexit government. They will believe any lie to maintain faith. I mean, that last part I think is true of some people. You know, Brexit for some people has absolutely just become an argument that they have to win. That's all there is to it. But in terms of the government blaming the people now, that absolutely would have been and still is their plan. I've no doubt about it. The lockdown, remember, wasn't put in place in order to try and contain the virus, because their plan was to let the virus free. They didn't change their minds overnight. They changed their minds based on the notion that they were going to get blamed for hundreds of thousands of deaths. So they thought, oh, we don't want to be blamed for it. So the lockdown was all about, you know, an ease in the lockdown was all about diverting that blame. So what will absolutely happen is they've said, well, there's these rules, you're still supposed to social... I mean, that's it, they'll just come back to social distancing. So if the rate, well, I say if the infection rate goes up, it's already gone up. We've already started to see the first signs of that this week. But we'll see it more definitely over the next few weeks. And, you know, the government will say, well, people aren't distancing. They'll even use the photos of the crowded beaches and things like that as proof, but people are not doing what we said, because we said, yes, you can go out, but you have to maintain a distance of 2 meters. And what will happen is the people who will just blame everyone else. I mean, we saw on a news thing the other week, I've talked about this in a couple of videos at least, about a woman on a crowded beach being interviewed by a journalist, and she said she had driven an hour and a half to get there. And she was complaining about everyone else on the beach. She wasn't the problem. It wasn't her fault if anything happens. It's everyone else on the beach. And yes, there'll be people that take that view. However, where it may fall down, I'm not going to say definitely, but where it may fall down is again that handling of the Dominic Cummings affair. Because now we have a situation where the public are actually quite angry and they're looking at the government saying, well, hang on a minute, it's one rule for you and the rest, and another rule for the rest of us. So when opposition, you know, not just opposition parties, but any political opposition to the government, including myself, says, well, this is an inevitable consequence of the government policy. And the government try to say, no, it's the people that weren't distancing. Well, there'll be more people, I would think now, much more inclined to go, hang on a minute, because they're no longer on the government side, going, hang on a minute, no, this is your fault for poor leadership. And I do think that now, because of the Dominic Cummings thing, their plan to blame others and have enough of the population go along with it will be weakened. And I'm not saying there won't be lots of people who won't go along with that. You know, the likes of the Telegraph and the Times and people, you know, people writing for these sort of papers that have called for the lockdown to be abolished, they'll back up the government's position, no doubt about it. They will blame small groups of people. They'll blame, well, this is actually the fault of the people who weren't using their common sense. Absolutely. But people in general, the general population, a larger proportion of them will, I think, that might have gone along with it and, it's my neighbour's problem. It wasn't my fault for going to the beach. It was everyone else's. Will now think, hang on, no. You, the government, told us we could go out and about now. And you, the government, told us to try and maintain our distance. But at the end of the day, if you're going to tell everyone they can go out and about, you can't physically maintain your distance. So actually, this is your fault. So I do think that they're going to have a tougher time of it. They will still try and blame the general public. And for some people that will work. But I think it will work for fewer people than it would ordinarily have done. Anyway, that's my view on that one. On to the next one. So, again, usually I've talked about this in another video as well. We might as well put it towards the start of another one. So, about the Dominic Cummings thing, what happens is you go through a bit of a cycle, don't you, when you're trying to when you're involved in tribal politics and you're trying to back up your side, where you shouldn't do that. You should always go. Obviously people pick a side in politics, but at the end of the day, when someone on your team lets a side down, you should actually be honest about that, because otherwise everything you say attacking the other side is worthless. But what they'll do is, first of all, they try to defend Cummings when they couldn't do that anymore. Oh yeah, but what about these Labour MPs? Now, first of all, they're naming a few Labour MPs here, only 3 of whom I found evidence actually broke lockdown rules. None of whom tell a lie, 1 of whom broke the law, because they were spoken to by police. The other ones the police weren't interested in. But there are rules that are not part of the law, and then there's the law as well. And no MP, and I said this before and I'll say it again, no MP should have broken any of the rules at all, because you have to set a better example. As an MP, you should set the example. And granted, none of these MPs decided on the rules. Like this person saying here, so Stammer will sack, these are Labour MPs, for those who don't know. How many miles did Kinnock drive? 200? Yeah, I'll come to that. It says, and these are MPs taking the piss out of lockdown, not a muggy advisor. Yeah, that muggy advisor is the one who came up with the rules. He is the one who formulated the rules and told Boris Johnson, here, sign this piece of paper that says these are the rules. And those are MPs, indeed, that had no say in it whatsoever. They had no say in the rules. And I don't mean by that they're opposition MPs and so they were outvoted anyway. Bear in mind the Labour leadership was fully supportive of the rules. No, I mean they weren't involved. MPs were not involved in the regulations. The government used emergency powers to develop the regulations themselves without any parliamentary scrutiny. So that final statement is utterly worthless in any context. But the other thing is this whole notion that why isn't Starmer sacking these MPs then? Simple, because he doesn't employ them. They're not paid by the Labour Party. They're not employees of the Labour Party. They're members. They pay the Labour Party, in fact. They pay to be a part of the Labour Party. And if you're going to ask, well, why doesn't he kick them out of the Labour Party then? Because he's got no grounds for doing so. Because they didn't break any party rules. And in terms of this particular one about Stephen Kinnock, by the way, Stephen Kinnock is a knobhead. And I don't actually want him to be in the Labour Party, quite frankly. But can I point to anything he's done that means he should be kicked out of the Labour Party? Yeah, he frequently and willfully voted against the whips when Jeremy Corbyn was leader on a regular basis. But then, as I've said before, Jeremy Corbyn doesn't really have the right to kick people out of the Labour Party either when he was leader, because he used to do that himself with previous Labour leaders. But nonetheless, there were grounds for withdrawing the whip from Stephen Kinnock under Jeremy Corbyn, but not under Keir Starmer. He hasn't broken any party rules. So it's as simple as that. But what you see here is this. In fact, actually, as I'm recording this today, I mean, this will be yesterday now when you're watching this, another Labour MP broke the lockdown rules. And it's actually appalling when MPs are doing this. You'll notice on my channel, I haven't had a bash at any Tory MPs that have broken the lockdown rules. They have as well. But I don't do that. The bottom line is, as far as I'm concerned, if you break the rules, you should not be in a position of influence. But when it comes to an MP, you're not employed by anyone. There's nothing that the party leaders can do about it, as long as they're not trying to defend the behaviour, which they're not. At the end of the day, who employs an MP? We do. We do. The people who vote for them. They don't have an employer as such. It's the people who vote for them. If you don't like what any of those MPs did with this or in relation to anything else, then don't bloody vote for them. And if one of these were my MPs, and there's only 3 of them, as I say, I found evidence that have broken the rules. It may be that the other one has and no one's shown me the proof. I've tried to find it, couldn't find it. Didn't spend ages looking for it, doesn't matter. Because none of them are my MP. If they were, and as a Labour member, I'd be thinking, well, I want to vote Labour, but I don't want to vote for this knobhead. So what I would be doing then is getting involved in the CLP, the Constituency Labour Party, and saying, this should not be our candidate. We should have a candidate that's actually worthy of the office. And that's what you do. But yeah, the Dominic Cummings thing, you have to bear in mind, he broke the law, and he broke it very seriously. He was infected. But yeah, sorry, I was going on about another Labour MP that's broken the rules this weekend, or found to have broken the rules this weekend. And what did she do? She resigned. She apologised and resigned. And this is the point. If Dominic Cummings had have apologised and offered to, he wouldn't have even had to have resigned. If he'd have just offered to resign, and Boris Johnson said, bloody hell, but, you know, he's apologised, he seems really sorry, he acted, you know, he was foolish, but I'm not accepting his resignation because, you know, I'm going to back him. It would all have got, none of this would have happened. None of this outrage would have happened. Would have all just been dealt with. That's the difference. There's been no apology, there's been no contrition, and he hasn't resigned from his position of influence. You know, that is the difference there. Anyway, on to the next one. So again, Dominic Cummings, no surprise, says he needs to be prosecuted. It's a fixed penalty, but he is in his rights to have it heard in court, but won't take kindly to his would-be perjury. Who won't take kindly to his would-be perjury? Of course he wouldn't risk that, accepting the £65 fine. I think it's £60 actually, but will not quibble. Means he lied to the PM. Can we not have a crowd fund for a private prosecution? Now, okay, there's two parts to this. The first part is, if it were another police force involved, I just told them, I'm trying to think of one that definitely do this, but I can't think of one offhand. But there are some police forces who would have fined him. They would say, look, if you've been found to have broken the rules, you are going to be issued with this fixed penalty notice. Which, you know, there's debate about what's the right way and the wrong way to do it. Durham Constabulary do not do that. So if Durham Police were to have issued him with the fine, it would have sent a very clear message, I agree. And you might argue that natural justice should say that they do that. However, as Durham Police themselves pointed out, they do not have a policy of fining people if they comply when they're told. You know, in other words, if they're found to be breaking the rules, the police talk to them and they go, oh, sorry, fair enough, and off they go. They haven't fined anyone else, so why should they fine Cummings? And that is fair enough. It stops this being tidy. On to the other point, this is more serious. Can we not have a crowd fund for a private prosecution? No. Other people have said this, and it's one of these areas of the law where I don't like to have an opinion myself until I've heard different points of view, especially within the legal profession. So the view within the legal profession seems to be crowd-funded private prosecutions of this nature are harmful. They don't actually help you. And the reason is fair enough, and it's because if people were to crowdfund a private prosecution for this criminal affair, it would be politically motivated. Let's make no bones about it. It would be politically motivated. It would be because we oppose Dominic Cummings being in the position he is and we want to get rid of him by fair means or foul. And that isn't a good look. That isn't a good look. You're basically using money to obtain justice, which is not right. And the other, and what that does is it allows Dominic Cummings' supporters or the Conservative supporters to make it look political. It's not political. He broke the rules. It's been noted that he broke the rules, and that's all there is to it. The government are defending that. It shouldn't be made political. Obviously, Boris Johnson's handling of it makes it political from that point of view, but it shouldn't be. And that's ultimately what you're doing. Because, like, who would crowdfund it? You know, imagine this group of people crowdfunding this private prosecution. How has Dominic Cummings harmed them? How are they a victim? They're not. They're funding it because they want to see Dominic Cummings face justice in court. Where, as you say, he wouldn't dare perjure himself. He'd have to admit it. He'd stick by the parts of his story that he thought you couldn't prove otherwise, but he would absolutely not tell lies in court. Just like Boris Johnson refused to tell lies in court last autumn. So yeah, so the people that would be putting this prosecution forward are not themselves victims. So it's not right that they put forward such an action. It's not, and who is it? Who is a victim in this? There may be victims. Don't get me wrong. If he believed that he and his wife were infected. There are more and more witness statements coming forward saying that he was seen out and about in the shops around Barnard Castle, which he said he was not. But so he may have infected someone, and someone may have, as a result of that, died. But we don't know that. So there isn't a definite victim in this, and so a private prosecution would not be the right way to go. It wouldn't be right, because when the shoe's on the other foot, we'd be outraged. If someone tried, for example, to crowdfund a private prosecution for someone on our side, let's say, that's broken the rules as well, we would think, oh, that's just politically motivated. Yeah, it would be politically motivated, just like this would be politically motivated. So for that reason, no. I am fully seized of the legal experts' view on this. Next one. So in terms of the lies and all coming out, says the problem with lies is that they need perfect memory. These two made a story like a schoolboy howler. Police certainly made me do it. Obviously, as a teacher, I can talk about some ridiculous lies that I've been told in my time. It's sometimes amusing. Sometimes when I have to listen, I don't know. I've done it. I've only taught sort of more mature learners, like college age kids in recent years. But when I have taught in schools, it's been quite spectacular to listen to some of the ridiculous lies. Because the problem is, particularly if the kid's not very bright and they come up with a lie that they think in their own head, well, I'd buy it. So they come out with this lie and you just want to say to them, you're calling them out on the lies anyway. I mean, I never make any bones about that. But you really just want to say to them, you can't. Do you think I'm as thick as you are to believe this? But in terms of this idea about lies needing a perfect memory, it's not always true in politics, though, is it? Because Boris Johnson has been caught out in lies any number of times. I mean, it's very similar to the Donald Trump thing when he was campaigning to become president. He would say one thing to one audience, and then the same day he'd say a contradictory thing to a different audience. He just told people what they wanted to hear. Boris Johnson's the same thing. It's recorded. You could play someone side by side, a recording of him saying a particular thing, and then at the same time saying the contradictory thing. And you'd go, yeah, okay, that's a lie. You don't need the perfect memory, because he doesn't have to tell the perfect lie, because people are going along with it. I mean, we've broken politics in this country. The US and the UK, we've both broken politics to the point where it's so partisan now. People go, well, if you prove that Boris Johnson's a lie, which is not difficult, they go, yeah, all right, he lies. So do all politicians. They'll just excuse it that way, because that in itself is not enough to convince people that he's not acting in their best interest. They still think he's acting in their best interest. And these people are going to be increasingly disillusioned when they see that he's lied after all. There's a big crunch time coming quite soon. With Brexit, of course, in terms of what he'll actually deliver compared with what he's promised. Because he's still promising all the great things that he's carried on promising, because we're not at that crunch time yet. When we get to it, and people see it for what it really is, some people will still just double think their heads through it. A lot of people are going to look at it, and they'll go, Boris lied. Yeah, you knew that. So now in politics these days, it used to be the case you did. It used to be the case in politics you must never be caught out in a lie, because if you were, you had to resign. No, not these days. No, the rules have been rewritten. Don't have to at all. You just brazen it out, and that's why it is very difficult, and to really hammer Boris Johnson, because he just brazens his way through it. He just lies. He just carries on with his lies, and when you expose the lie, he just carries on with it, because he doesn't care. Because if 80% of the people watching the debate where he's just been exposed as a liar go, "Ooh, you liar," there'll be 20% that just excuse it away, or didn't watch that bit. So he'll carry on with it, knowing that there's enough people going away with the lies and believing the lies that it doesn't matter if most people see it for what it is. But anyway, there we are. Next one. So, says last week, as a person who is shielding, I received 2 letters from the NHS. The first said I must continue to stay indoors throughout June, which I expected. The second letter was telling me that if I needed to go to hospital, I must take my own car and ask for a mask at reception, or if I needed hospital transport, I would be given a mask when they arrived. Today, the government announces that people who are shielding are allowed out from tomorrow. WTF. Yes, I mean, ultimately what this is evidence of is the government making things up on the fly. It is yet again an example of how we can see that this notion that they're taking the right steps at the right time is a complete nonsense. It's always been a nonsense because it's always contradicted things they were saying just before. And like you said here, the position obviously from government was in the form of the letters you've received there, which say actually you're vulnerable. We haven't controlled this virus yet. In fact, I mean, that's the thing as well. I pointed out yesterday, I have to point it out again. If you think about where we were in terms of our containment of the virus at the start of the lockdown. So at that point, the virus was sufficiently out of control that we needed the lockdown. But because we haven't really done anything to control the virus whilst we had the lockdown was buying the government time to get a grip on it, to get a grip on the test, trace and isolate system. But it hasn't. It hasn't done that. It's improved the testing a bit, although there's been no improvement literally in the last month. Not without fiddling the figures. And even with the fiddled figures, it hasn't been much of an improvement, as noted by the fact that the government are no longer reporting on the numbers of people tested. You know, if you look in the little box, it says NA or unknown. It's unknown, isn't it? That's it, unknown. But, you know, so what they're now doing is they're reacting to headlines. You know, if you look at the tracing program, for example, that was supposed to come out today at the point at which you're watching this. I mean, it's not out today. It's not going to be out at the end of the month. But they tried to say, we're rolling it out last week. But they told the people who work on the scheme the previous evening. Obviously, they weren't ready because they didn't have they've not been set up. It's not been designed to be ready for last week. But they did so because the following headlines. I think we need to change the headlines. And it's the same thing with telling people on the, you know, Matt Hancock, for example, I think it's you're referring to, saying, oh yeah, you can go out now, but make sure you still distance. And it's done to generate headlines. You know, because they don't want the headlines carrying on about Dominic Cummings or you know, they tried to obscure the Dominic Cummings headlines with the cock up over the tracing program, and then someone said, but our tracing program's even more of a cack-handed response than Dominic Cummings. Oh, we need some better headlines, because that's what they went. They went for different headlines, but something that's still attacking the government. Oh, we need some better headlines. Freedom, you know. So they get all the headlines about the fact that you can go out and about now, because and it did. It worked. It generated the headlines. Most papers were reporting on that. You know, and obviously what I would say to anyone in this position is, if you are at all imagine that the lockdown's still in place. Can you still carry on like that? And I don't mean can you still carry on like that as in how you're coping, you know, like emotionally. You know, can you physically cope like that? If you can, just carry on. Carry on. You know, if you're someone who would normally like to be out and about in public, do you have to be? If the answer is no, don't go. Like anyone going to a beach now, it shouldn't be doing. It's that simple. I understand there are obviously people who've been cooped up in like flats, tower blocks, where there isn't their own private space outside. I have a great deal of sympathy for people like that every now and then just getting out. Can understand that. But for most people just don't. And I know some people are going to be forced to work. They have to go to work. Okay, you can't help that. That will sometimes mean going on public transport. Can't be helped. But for people who can help it, they need to continue to help it. It's one of these weird situations now. We're not getting the correct leadership from the government. So we have to do things ourselves. Of course, it's going to be a complete disaster because we are going to basically behave like 66 million people that have no leadership. With very predictable results. But we just have to think in terms of like protecting ourselves. You have to go out with the attitude that You first of all, you make two assumptions. First of all, you think to yourself, let's say I am infected. What am I doing to protect others around me? Then you go thinking about yourself as well. Right, let's say everyone around here in this public area that I'm in is infected. What am I doing to reduce the chances of contracting the infection myself? And I think people just now have to think those two things every time they go out. But for vulnerable people in particular, it's the second one. You've really got to think to yourself, can we assume that everyone around me is infected? It's a little bit like my mum. She told me years ago, her driving instructor said to her, just assume that everyone on the road is an idiot. I think the same thing applies here. Not just in terms of assume they're an idiot. Assume that they're infected. Assume that everyone, when you go out, is infected. When you go into a shop, assume everyone's infected. Do you feel safe? If the answer is no, then try and do something to improve your safety. No, help. I've got a thing in my way. There we go, let's get rid of that. Next one. So, someone here saying it's a real shame there's no PMQs this week. Obviously now referring to last week. There is this week. I'd love to see that train wreck. I'll tell you the real... it is. They shouldn't have gone off. It's absolute madness. Normally they would have gone off in that particular week. But given that they've been working remotely, there was no need to. It shouldn't have happened. Normally the reason... Because a lot of people say in an emergency situation, of course, MPs shouldn't be dissolving Parliament, things like that. Not that they're dissolving Parliament, but, having a recess. But the argument has to come back. MPs are not just doing their jobs in Parliament, they're doing their jobs in their local constituencies, and obviously they need time to be able to do that. And also, I don't begrudge MPs the odd actual genuine holiday as well. But at the moment, there's nowhere to go on holiday. They're already in their constituencies. They're limited in what they can do by getting out and about in those constituencies. So a lot of it's going to be communication with their constituents remotely, as it is, emails and so on. And they can, there's nothing to stop them conducting their duties in both Parliament and their local constituencies from their own home, as long as, they all go along with that. But in terms of the train wreck, I thought last week was bad enough for the Conservatives. The Conservatives were massively hitting the polls. It wasn't just Boris Johnson personally. Boris Johnson, from a personal point of view, was really mauled in the polls. The public have really turned against him. But even the Conservative Party, and that's without Labour. Labour obviously spoke out against the behaviour of Dominic Cummings and against Boris Johnson's decision to handle it the way he did. But that's about it, and they suffered phenomenal damage. And that means that the Prime Minister's questions that we get as a result of not having one last week, it actually makes this one coming spicier. I will be looking forward to it eagerly, but also with a certain amount of trepidation, because it's one of these things where we can't just assume because Starmer's stitched him up 3 times out of 3 that it's going to continue. Obviously, we might imagine the sort of things that Keir Starmer is going to bring up at Prime Minister's questions. But what I'll always say is the criteria for what questions the Leader of the Opposition should be asking of the Prime Minister is not based on what is the most serious thing to ask them, what's the most important, anything like that. It's what can you pin on them? What can you do to make them look properly stupid? And that's what it has to be based around. And it may well be that Dominic Cummings... what I would maybe be thinking... Because I'll be honest, I cannot think of a question to ask to really put the Dominic Cummings thing under the spotlight. Because as far as I'm concerned, the Conservative government have done their damage on that. I think what I would probably do is just throw in a little sly aside as part of another question. So I would make mention of it, but I wouldn't ask a question about it because... why bother? You know what response you're going to get. Don't ever ask a question where you know what the response is going to be. You have to try and come up with ones that just expose the Prime Minister, and preferably ones that he can't think of what to say about, that he has to and ah a lot about. So yeah, this week it could be very, very spicy. And there's plenty to go at as well. I'm sure what he will ask about is the tracing programme that Boris Johnson twice promised would be in place on the 1st of June. It's not, of course, so we can tackle that. Obviously, Boris Johnson will just try and brazen that out as well. But, yeah, it was a shame there were no PMQs last week, but I'm not actually sure any more damage would have been done if there were, the way it played out. I'm really not. I think they did themselves enough damage without that parliamentary scrutiny. Just the scrutiny by media did them enough damage. Anyway, last one this week. So, the Mail asking... Again, this was about the Dominic Cummings saga. The Mail, which very much turned against the government on this front, the Mail asks, what planet are they on? My answer would be the one you created for them and put them on. And yeah, I mean, this is it. We have to bear in mind that the media are, in many ways, worse hypocrites than the worst politicians. Give you a little example that also happened last week. So, Emily Maitlis, for those who don't know, BBC presenter on Newsnight, which was critical of the government. And she gave an introduction to her piece, which was entirely factual, by the way. But, the Conservatives dogpiled on the BBC, and the BBC had to apologise for it the next day. They did nothing wrong, and actually they hadn't even followed their own editorial systems for responding to so-called criticism. It was all an absolute shambles. But what was interesting was the way it was portrayed in the news, because I saw it in quite a lot of the right-wing press. Again, they dogpiled onto the situation. They were saying, the BBC's broken its guidelines and the BBC did this and the BBC did that. And this is why the BBC are actually stupid to be given into this political pressure. I understand, but they really shouldn't be, because they're not helping themselves. Because the newspapers, the right-wing newspapers, savaged the BBC. They owned up to breaking their own editorial guidelines. They're biased, blah, 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 blah. And when I was reading this, I thought to myself, because this was in the likes of the Telegraph, for example, in there particularly that I was looking at. And I was thinking to myself, what Emily Maitlis said in this thing that has now been criticised by the government and government supporters was no different to what these newspapers were saying themselves. In fact, these newspapers were going further. So the newspapers weren't attacking it because it really was a biased thing she said. It wasn't. It absolutely wasn't biased. They weren't attacking it for that. They're attacking it because the BBC is their competitor. And that's what you have to sort of realise whenever you see one section of the media commenting on what another section of the media have done. They're competitors. They will seek to undermine them whenever they can. But again, it was a classic example of newspapers, one section of the media attacking another section of the media for saying what they themselves had said. What they themselves have said. And yeah, the Daily Mail they've created this government that they were last week attacking for being useless and incompetent and dishonest, disingenuous. They created that. They supported that. The Daily Mail knew that Boris Johnson had no substance. The Daily Mail knew that Boris Johnson has no plan for the country. They didn't care. They thought, or their bosses thought, that they can just control Johnson, throw the Tories a few quid every now and then and get him to do whatever they want. And then they have the nerve to complain that he's killing the Conservatives' credibility in the public. It's like, what are you doing? You encouraged an incompetent man to lead the government. What did you expect? But there it is. I shall leave it there for this week. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.